So remember to actually jot down your questions so you don't forget, because if you're anything like me, I will forget, and then like I had a question, but I don't know what it is. So please just write it down. And then this slide here for the trivia or pursuit for discipline knowledge. So this is based on session 1 and 2. Now, in any school setting, we know that we have to assess to see where kids are at, right? So we're sort of doing the same thing with us. We're going to assess and see where we're at, but we also may have some new folks who are joining us today who are here for the first time. So we want to make sure that they can understand what we reviewed, and also this is a good place for them to learn where we're going with this information. So I'm going to start off by asking some questions. You can utilize your chat, and we have someone looking into the chat, so no worries about that. And then you can also raise your hand. And unfortunately, I can't see you raising your hand, so I'm going to have to ask my team if they could help me by calling on someone. That would be terrific. So let's start with the first question. What is the definition of removal from a class? And oh, by the way, you can cheat. You can go back to the first and second PowerPoint, and you can also go on the school discipline website or EdSite. So any responses on what a removal is?
Nothing in chat yet. And I don't see any hands raised. No.
I'll give you a hint. It has to do with a certain amount of time.
Anybody willing to venture a guess?
Okay, so I'm gonna move on. So removal means an exclusion from classroom for all parts of a single class period, no more than 90 minutes, sorry. So it shall not go or extend beyond 90 minutes. There we go.
Right, so anything over 90 minutes is not a removal.
And that is considered an in-school and out-of-school suspension. Okay, let's try for another one. Don't get nervous now. This is actually really be very interactive so that we can know how much we've learned. There's no real wrong answers here. So let's really try to work together. So let's go to the second question. What is child find, and why is child find so important?
Feel free to raise your hands or put it in the chat. Nothing in chat.
Nothing in chat and no hands raised.
Nope.
Okay. So child find, as you remember from, oh, wait, here we have someone.
We got something, right? You want me to read it? If eligible under IDEA, the student would have the right for a manifestation determination.
That is correct. What we really want to say about child find too is that it really is something where a student is repeatedly suspended or expelled, and also maybe experiencing or exhibiting certain patterns of behavior, and that we need to sort of figure out what's going on with the child. And so then it could be anything from school discipline, it could be chronic absenteeism, but it is a referral to a PPT and to actually decide on what we're going to do as far as the evaluation. But also this is very inclusive with families so that they're sitting at the table so that we can actually figure out what's going on. And before it gets to the point of where we're being reactive rather than proactive. And that's really what we're trying to do here. All right, I'm gonna just do one more. Hey, Jane, do you wanna do the fourth one across the bar? And then we can just actually sort of move on.
Sure. So the one that is, what are the 2 questions to be asked and answered in a manifestation determination meeting?
Yes.
Does anybody know what those 2 questions are? If you're holding manifestation meetings, I suspect most of you know the answer to that one. So what are the 2 questions to be answered? And CPAC staff, if you want to put it in the chat, you're welcome to too, because I'm sure you know the answers as well.
I'll just answer. Oh, someone put in the chat. Is it behavior related to the student's disability?
Thank you. That's question 1.
We didn't have an answer for the second one, so we'll say, is the IEP sufficient? I don't know the exact word, but sufficient for the student, and is it being followed? I think, right, to the intent.
Thanks. Kim, did you want to comment on that at all? Or?
No, you're right on point. I think also one of the things that we are finding through some calls from families is that we also ask the question if they need a translator, because sometimes there's a lot of information to be shared when it comes to preparing for a suspension or expulsion, especially in an expulsion. And sometimes they don't understand everything that is quote unquote very law-ish
Or jargon.
Or jargon. So I think it has to, so they may actually do just fine on a regular basis, but when we start having all this jargon about the law, I think sometimes we should ask, not sometimes, but we should ask that question.
Whether interpretation is needed, yeah.
So we'll leave this here because we're not getting a lot of participation, which is okay. But we'll leave these questions here for you, and they will be available so that you can sort of actually test yourself. But you can also bring these questions to your team when you are actually looking at data. And these are some things that you might want to be thinking about and putting into consideration when you're thinking of professional learning for your staff. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is really a very crazy slide, and it is very purposeful because we want you to sort of understand that each school and district must have a custom fit, and it has to be very intentional in addressing the multi-layered needs of our children. And really, when I look at this slide, I really want to express that no child is one-dimensional. So the impact of our actions can't be one-dimensional. And so if you look at the slide, you know, the student here is doing pretty well in math calculations, class participation, reading, decoding, so on and so forth in the green area. But if you go up in the gold and yellowish area, you know, we can see that he or she is struggling with reading fluency, reading comprehension, but also some social emotional learning needs are definitely needed, like self-regulation, self-esteem, social interactions, and communication. So we have to really look at that and figure out what are the targets that we want to have for that particular child. And then if you go up to tier 3, you're going to see that the child has witnessed some violence. And that is when we really look at more intensive services. Now, that does not mean that we will always have services provided to the student in tier 3 every day for 188 days out of the year, but it does mean that we are at this moment, this happened, and we need to address it. And so that particular student may need some internal supports as well as external supports, meaning community providers, but we have to work with the family so that we are giving the right supports to the child. The other thing that I want to mention about this slide is that it is a continuum. So if I'm providing tier 2 supports, I am not giving up tier 1 supports. I'm still providing those supports to that student. The same if it's tier 3, I am providing tier 1 and 2 supports in addition to tier 3. Next slide. So what do we know about the research? Now, there's a lot of research out about school discipline, and these here on the left-hand side is really about what has been pretty much evidence-based, has been researched over and over again, and these are the core features that have been coming up every single time. So we need a systematic problem solving approach. And we're going to talk a lot about that today with you about data teams. And I also want you to know that you don't have to reinvent a new team or start a new team or reinvent your team. You can use the current teams that you have, and we'll talk more about that. Also, relationships and connectiveness in schools really do matter. So who does the student have a relationship with, but also the simple things as the interaction when a student walks into your classroom. You can gauge how they're feeling, if they might have had a bad day, but you can pretty much gauge your students if you know who they are. And this is also building that foundation of trust, not only with the student, but with the family. The other thing is about adult advocates. Who's advocating for a child? If a child has issues maybe in one classroom, but doesn't in another, what are the skill sets? What is that teacher or educator doing in that other classroom that might help the other teacher? So it's a collaborative approach. We also need to look at policy alignment and practice. When we look at our code of conduct, I wonder how many times do we look at it, really? Do we look at it in the sense of, is it restorative? Does it repair the harm? Does it really look at anything that is subjective that can be used, like disrespect, disorderly conduct, all those kind of words that can be very subjective? And do we have that kind of language in our policy? The other piece is policy aligned to that practice? So are we doing what we say that we're going to do? And is it consistent? Are we using the same language so that everyone is on the same page, meaning all the educators and also the students do really understand? And this includes professional learning. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about professional learning, but I do want you to know that coaching and technical assistance is really important. It's not just the actual workshop, but what we do after the workshop. And then, of course, academic supports and enrichment is really important because if a kid is struggling, we know a good example is the reading in the classroom out loud. And if a student doesn't want to read out loud, most likely he'll do something or she will do something to get themselves kicked out of the class, right? And so that you don't have to call on them. So we have to really be prepared and be able to think about different strategies and ways to work with students around academic development and enrichment. Evidence-based practices regarding behavior and social emotional learning. There are tons of evidence-based practices out there. There are some research-based practices and promising practices as well. So we're not saying you can't use them, but really take a look at the evidence-based practices because they have been vetted, number one, but they're reliable and they're valid and they work for a particular school population. And that's why that's really important. Was someone saying something? Okay. And then we're going to talk more about progress monitoring and fidelity of implementation. You can't have fidelity of implementation without reviewing progress monitoring. You just can't. So that is critical component of this. And then personalized learning, understanding how that student learns and being able to diversify how you teach and facilitate in your classroom. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, we have people, data, policy, practices, and systems. Okay, I just talked about all of that on the left-hand side, right? But now, if you see in the red there, we have to look at it from 3 instructional levels. We'd have to look at our personal stuff in the classroom and how we interact with our students. And what does that look like? We have to look at it in an instructional way, and is that school-wide instructional practices? And then we have to also look at the institution, meaning that the larger picture, the district. Are we aligned? Are we consistent? So that we are building a systematic approach in addressing students' needs. So I'm going to show you a really quick video. It's only like 2 minutes long, but it's really cool because the students, it really shows how you can do this one simple thing in your classroom to connect with your students. And you can do this in the high school level, middle school, or elementary. The example here is elementary, but high school, you may not, do the hugging thing as much, but you might have some really cool, like handshakes and things like that. So think about that. Can you start the video?
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then I just want to verify that everyone can hear it. Give me 1 second.
The driver for learning is the social connection. Activating a child's cognitive skills begins with activating their social connectedness. Children in this school are starting the day with an adult saying to them, I see you, I know you, I'm connecting with you, and you're important to me.
We start each day by greeting every kid at the door.
Good morning, Declan.
You look pretty, Miss Turner.
Thank you, baby. Guess what I sing this weekend?
Every classroom does some variation of, would you like a high five, handshake, or hug? Essentially, it's what greeting would you like?
How you doing, handsome?
Good.
There is a great deal of cultural sensitivity and empowerment for children to say, here is how I want to greet you.
High five, handshake, or hug. You got your hair done? Good morning, Molly. You got your hair done? Let me just turn around. I love it. All right, we're gonna have a good day today? All right. High five, handshake, or hug.
During that time, I'm just trying to connect with them,
All right.
help them from the transition from home to school, and just kind of like a pulse check to see where they are.
Oh, I knew you wanted a hug. How you feeling today, sir?
Good.
We're gonna have a good day? Look at my eyes.
Do they look escalated? Do they look triggered? Do they look upset? So it's a way for me to see, okay, who needs to be where? How can I help? How can I be assistance to start their day off most effectively?
Good morning, Ariella. How you doing today?
I'm being very intentional about my interactions with students, right? So it's not just I'm in the back of the room, hey, come in. No, I'm making a connection with them. I have eye contact with them. I'm checking in how they're doing. I'm checking to make sure they're okay.
Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
I think the impact is deep relationships. I get to know my students, I get to check in with them. I get to find out something about them. They get to find out something about me. We get to make a connection. And that starts with the greeting at the door.
All right, come on in.
So a child is walking in the door feeling cared for, empowered, and encouraged. And that teacher is focusing in on who that child is. And that's how the day starts.
Thank you.
I love that.
So that is really important. And we even like it as adults, right? How we're greeted by our bosses in the morning, how our peers at work. I mean, it's really important to like have that connection. And so why don't we do that at school? Now, there's a couple things in that video I do want to just call out for a second. Like if you have students who are maybe who have autism, they are not going to maybe make eye contact with you. So you have to, I know that they use eye contact quite a bit in there, but you have to use other strategies rather than just thinking about eye contact. The other thing that you may not feel comfortable with hugs, that's okay. Actually, one school I know here in Connecticut actually has like little, they designed like little circles and posted it on the outside of their door before the students walk in. And the students can actually choose which one they want. So if they want to do a fist, if they want to do a little jiggle and dance. So there's all these other options that you can do to make it work. But it's, again, it's just really something very simple that you can do to build connection. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So the how. So how do we really do this and think of it in a systematic way? With all the other things that we have going on, we have tons of other initiatives that are going on. We probably even have initiative fatigue. I've been having conversation with educators. Some of them are burnt out. So the question really becomes like, how do we build these systems so that we're doing more on the front end and not working in an upside down triangle where we're in crisis mode all the time, but more of we're like functioning and building proactive, preventative early intervention model instead. So the how. So the first thing is for school discipline is that you need to think about your team. And then you have to think about who in your school should be on that team. Now, if you do a district-wide team, that's actually good too, but I know that schools have their individual data teams as well. And you can do that with your internal staff, but you also want to make sure that you're being very inclusive with your community. Like you might want to look at your community providers and also families. Now, granted, I know that there's sensitive data. And so maybe the community folks maybe are not looking at that data when you're breaking it out by student, but the overall and the idea around what can we do about these is really important because there are a lot of contributing factors to school suspensions. And so they may have a different perspective that they can bring to the table. And I think also student voice is really important. Having students, you know, who are impacted by the behavior in the classroom, but also the students who are impacted who are getting suspended is really important as well. And then the how is really having a really good collection data system. And if you don't have one of those, you know, you can go onto our website and use EdSite, which was also identified in the first session, to actually break down some of the data so you can have some data point to review. And then we're going to gather this data and then we're going to analyze this data, but we're going to break this data down, disaggregate it, so that we can really look at particular groups and populations. So we can do that by grade level, special education, race, ethnic background, English learners, and free and reduced lunch is just to give you a few examples, and also male and female, obviously. And then I do want you to think about when you're having these meetings, you're bringing your policies to the table with you, because we have to understand what the policy is, but we also have to understand what is our belief around learning. What is our belief around students' motivation in learning? And we have to have these kind of courageous conversations so that we can get to the root cause of what's really going on. And I certainly will talk more about that. And we also have to think about what the human capital need is. So what do the teachers need? If we're talking about classroom management, what is it that we actually need to help them with? And also giving them the opportunity to be able to work with other teachers and educators so that they can actually learn from each other. Then the other bullet is understanding the root cause and the need, and I will definitely be going in a little bit more detail on that, so stay tuned. Establishing targets is really critical, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. And action that's needed, and I actually have a sample of an action plan that you can actually walk away with and have and start tomorrow. And then this resource mapping initiative inventory is critical to understanding what you have as far as initiatives. And I think we're going to show that in 1 second. Joby, I think it's going to show it to us.
Yes, I'm working on it.
No worries. So this is actually from the University of North Carolina. And this is all about implementation science. And so it's very simple. What we want to know is, what is the initiative? Is it mandated or not? Who is involved in that? Who's leading it? What target population is that initiative for? And what is the financial commitment that we have with that particular initiative? And it can be an intervention, a program, strategy, whatever you want to call it. And then also the initiative start date and end date. The relationship to the district, priorities, and strategic operating plan. This is also another critical piece, is that sometimes we have all these initiatives all over the place, but they're not aligned to what our outcome is for our strategic operating plan. And then what is the expected outcome with measures? And then what evidence are you going to look at to show that you had that outcome? Very simple, very straightforward. And it's very easy to use. And I would actually coordinate with your entire school. You can do this district-wide or school-wide and really look at all the initiatives so that you're resource mapping where your gaps are, but also where your strengths are. Okay. I'll go ahead and get started. Oh, there it is. Okay. So just to finish up, so what interventions within that system, and I'm going to talk about how do you figure out an intervention that can work? How do you know that your interventions that you're currently using are working? Obviously, you can look at your data, you can say, well, our interventions aren't working, right? However, is it because of the implementation? Is it because of capacity? There could be other issues that is impacting that intervention, that's why it's not working versus the intervention is just not any good. And then announcement. I encourage everyone to share data and be very transparent with your school community and your families about what's happening in the school. And also share this information with your faculty and also share this information with your school board so that everyone is on page and they understand the sense of urgency around this need, but also they may be able to help with the impact. Next slide. So key components of effective discipline includes, this is really about school-wide behaviors. Okay, so this is an expectation so that everyone is consistent, and that is expectations and routines in school-wide are taught in a consistent manner, and they're also reinforced. You have to, that is your foundation on what you're going to do. And we need to make sure that we understand them as adults and we model them as adults, but more importantly, that our students understand. And then we also understand, they understand what the consequences are. And let's also include the families with that. Because families, rather than getting the phone call that we're going to have to remove, so-and-so from the class, and then the parents like all upset, it's a different kind of conversation when they're up, they know what the policy is, what the expectations are, what the routines are. Then you say, I just want to call and let you know that again, there was an issue with Johnny. And he did break this rule, and this is going to be some of the consequences, but we're going to have a teaching moment for him. And then the parent or guardian is going to be on board with that rather than being surprised and also being like, well, why are you doing this to my kid? Are you doing this to the other kids? So this is really a different kind of conversation if we're really inclusive up front. The other thing is, did you know that the Latin word discipline actually means systems, instruction, learning, and teaching? Yes. And it's a strength-based approach. So we're not looking at the deficit of the actual action that took place, but we're looking at the whole child and saying, how can we help and have growth in that area, but also looking at the strengths of the student and bringing that to the forefront so that it is a teachable moment. It's a whole different way of thinking, and it's very compassionate learning. Then we talk about the tiered system for social emotional behavioral supports. And I'm definitely going to talk more about that with MTSS. And then data-based decision-making with problem-solving teams. Again, you do not have to reinvent the wheel. You can use the teams that you have. If you already have an SRBI team, then that is more than sufficient. And then positive adult role models, which I talked about earlier, and then ongoing professional learning. I cannot stress this enough because just having a workshop like this, for example, is not going to be enough there needs to be more of technical assistance and coaching. And one of the things that we are doing at the State Department is that we have partnered with the REST and also CERC to make sure that we're doing the professional learning pieces, but at the same time, we're also providing technical assistance and coaching. Next one.
Tim, I did want to point out the time to you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's 1:10. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so multi-tiered systems of support. And if you look at this on the left-hand side, these are the core features that you have. So leadership needs to be involved in the decision-making. There needs to be collaboration, again, going back to evidence-based, inclusion, equity, policy and practices again. And then, of course, data, continuum of supports. I mean, I've already talked about all of these things, but it does work when you're talking about integration of your system. So social, emotional, behavioral, academics, college and career ready. And I do want to point out that I have physical health on there because there's sometimes when, things like I had 1 year where I had 2 students, one who had leukemia and one who had a brain tumor. And so I had to figure out for crisis for tier 3, how are we going to coordinate efforts because scheduling changes, not being in school. So those are kind of things that we have to really think about. And also the other thing that to make us very intentional is that when we're thinking of multi-tier systems of support, we are also thinking about those interventions that are academic, but also are crossing over between the alignment or integration. So I said integration before, but I really want to stress that you have to decide if those interventions are going to be in alignment or are they going to be integrated? And there is a difference. So when you're integrating, you're actually possibly changing a little bit about that program or strategy. But if you're aligning, you're keeping the integrity of that strategy or that intervention. Okay, so let's get down to the part that I've been talking about. I'm going to get to. So we're here. So this is about gathering. This is already done for you. It's been vetted. It's evidence-based. Actually, the turnaround office uses this. And so I didn't want to give you another thing when this is already in place. So you can take this and run with it. So one is gathering the evidence and really looking at your data and analyzing your data. And this is when you're going to do that process of disaggregating your data to see where there is any concerns. Additionally, you want to add in some multiple pieces of data, right? You want to look at maybe chronic absenteeism data. You maybe want to look at parent surveys. You might want to look at school climate surveys and really bring this to the table so that you can have a rich discussion about what's happening and why. And then once you get to brainstorming, there are some things in here that are contributing factors to the student being suspended. And we have to think about what those are and identify them. Before we can even get to the root cause, we have to think about what are those things. So is it possibly the policy around policy violations? And if they are around policy violations, are they fair and equitable or not? So these are the kind of conversations that we are having around brainstorming. Then we get to the section about root cause. Now I can do a complete workshop on root cause analysis. But what I do want you to know is that the root cause analysis, always remember it is taking what the data is and then making it and putting it to action. Putting it into action. So we're taking what we know and what we found, and now we're going to put it into action planning. And also it tells you the why. Why is this happening? And the why is really critical because now we have the contributing factors, we have the data, now we can design our target of what we want to address. Make sense? So we got the data, we got the contributing factors, we figured it out. we got our root cause. Now we're going to call for action on this. And then you can do that in several ways, by the way, with the root cause. You can do the fishbone, if anyone remembers the fishbone, which is the problems at the head of the fish. And then you have these like little bones that are sticking out, and then you put in the contributing factors and you have a discussion around that. Or you can do the 5 whys, which is around why is this happening? And then you keep on asking the why. So either way, it's perfectly fine. You can get a lot more information on this on our website, on the SDE website, which is also in our resource section. Okay, so I'm going to move along because you remember what I said earlier is that I'm going to look at existing programming and how is it working. So let's talk about the hexagon tool. And just ignore the name because that could be just another thing that you have to do, and it's not. You actually do this when you're assessing if you want a new or looking at an existing program, strategy, or intervention. This is also a part of Turnaround Office. They have done training with all the Alliance districts on that. And also internally, all of our staff have been trained on this as well. And so what it is it looks at 6 different components. The need. So we already identified the need, right? We actually said the need is that we need to, let's say it is disproportionately African-American Black students are being suspended from school at this rate. Okay, so let's just use that as an example. So the question becomes when we're looking at a intervention, we need to understand the need. So we've identified what the need is that we need an intervention that's going to address that issue. Then we need to know the fit. So does it align to our current priorities? Is it aligned to our community and values, that intervention? And also, does it fit the population? Meaning, has the research been done with this population and setting of students in this demographic? If it has not, then I don't recommend it. If it has, that's like a high point to say maybe this is a possibility. And then you of course want to look at the grade level. The other thing is about capacity. So do you have the capacity right now to implement this? Meaning staff and also financial. So do you have the human capital and the financial capital to implement this well? And also you have to sort of map out how are you going to do this as far as the professional learning and coaching. And then actually evidence, basically the evidence to demonstrate the strategy is effective. Is there evidence that it does that? If it doesn't, then you probably don't want it. And then the other thing is the supports. This is really where it goes back to now. Remember how I said the how, and we talked about that mapping initiative inventory? Okay, pull that sheet out and look at it as a team and say, hey, okay, this is these are the initiatives that we have. This is what we're looking for to address this particular need. Do we have it already? And is it that we're just not implementing it well and we need to just make some adjustments? Or is it that we are, that we need to actually reevaluate and actually get something else to take care of that gap? And then of course, lastly is usability. And then actually being able to measure, are these essential components and practices good enough for making inroads and making changes to this particular problem that we want to address, identified under the root cause. So that's a lot of information, but if you want to go back and look, I also have this hyperlinked so that you can go into detail regarding this, and also you can look on our website. But this is a critical point because I have to be honest with you, whenever I go to schools and I do site visits, this is a conversation that we always end up having around making sure that we are using the right interventions and strategies for our students, meaning even if it's tier 1, 2, or 3. And then I have a sample here of an action plan, just very simple. You have your goal. You're going to identify the strategy that you want to use, and then what are the action actual action steps that you're going to take. And then who's going to be responsible is critical. And then the resources that are needed based on, again, going back to your resource inventory, you already have your resource mapping, so you can just actually identify that right away. But you also in this area want to look at professional learning. And then progress monitoring. How are you going to do it? What benchmarks are you going to look at? And then your completion date, and then evidence of the fact that you've done it. And this is when you do the announce, when you actually share your information publicly. And lastly, before we get into a case study, I do want to just show you this in a one picture. As far as, oh, I don't know if we're on the right slide. So I'll go ahead and continue, and hopefully we can catch up. But on this slide here, we're talking about the same things about building that coherent system that I was talking about earlier. And how do we, what is the data that we're using? Is it aligned to our strategic operating plan? And then also, you want to think about your mission, vision, and beliefs. We have those, right? And they are our foundation. But we need to make sure that we're aligned to that and within our strategic operating plan. Then the next step again is going through that resource mapping, aligning your initiatives and looking at evidence-based practices. And then that's when we build out our action plan, and then we have that continuum of support. And then we start with the progress monitoring and setting those benchmarks of what we're going to assess and how often. And then we're going to actually look at the evaluation on what is our outcome, and then reflect, and then decide what we're going to do to make improvements in the following year. So let's practice a little bit here. I have a scenario for you, and hopefully it'll show up pretty soon. There we go. It's awesome. Thank you. So the scenario, I'm going to read it to you. And this, I really want you to think about the situation. If you think the teacher could have done something differently, if this is part of any kind of mitigating factors for the child, and also, should this be an out of school, in-school suspension, or maybe neither? So we're going to have a conversation about that. So think about those questions. So I'm going to read it to you. So the scenario is, Jamie receives special education services due to delays in emotional development with an IEP for full inclusion in 9th grade. While working on a project at his desk, he is talking loudly to himself. After several prompts, the teacher comes over and stands next to Jamie's desk and tells him to stop. He pushes away from his desk and says in a loud voice, "Get away from me." To try to de-escalate the situation, the teacher then leans in closely to whisper, "You need to be quiet. You are disturbing the class." He pushes away even more and rises to his feet and shouts, "I already said, leave me alone." The teacher tries to guide Jamie to the back of the room with her body, but not making any contact. Jamie pushes past her and saying, "I have to get my pencil," bumping her aside with his body as he passes. At this very moment, the principal was looking into the classroom because of the noise and immediately intervenes. The teacher is asked to meet with the principal to discuss the suspension of Jamie. The teacher describes the situation and points out that Jamie does have some issues with impulse and was actually trying to retrieve his pencil from his desk so that he could be moved into the back of the room. Okay, so some questions. Are there any mitigating factors that we should consider in this scenario? And you can put it in the chat or raise your hand if you feel comfortable.
So one mitigating factor might be his impulse, his impulsivity.
That's right. Absolutely. Anything else?
There's something in the chat. Let me check. Oh, no.
No, nothing in the chat?
No, nothing.
Okay, and so he does have some issues around impulse control, right? But there also is that, do you think anything was intentional?
On Jamie's part,
Yeah.
it sounded like the teacher was not feeling that way.
Yeah, I don't think in this particular scenario is that, because if he has an impulse control issue, it's when that's sort of like a normal, like a reaction, they're very reactionary. And also the fact that he's talking out loud to himself in his chair seems like a very common behavior for him. So we're sort of like, that's part of us working with the student. So it's not like the child had ill intent with pushing the teacher per se, right? It wasn't like ill intent. That was just his reaction to the situation.
There is something in chat, Kim. There was de-escalation techniques were not done.
Bingo. Okay, so we're going to move on then, because that's actually when I was asking the question about could the teacher have done something differently? What could she have done differently?
What kind of de-escalation strategies?
How about let me just give an example. How about when she went over to his desk and asked him to stop talking? What is there a problem? Is there a possible problem with that, depending on who the student is? Anyone who want to take a?
Do you mean in the sense that he's talking to himself maybe for a reason?
Yeah, but I think also it could be space. Because you notice that the teacher came over, leaned over, was talking to him quietly, but she might have invaded his space. And so that's why he pushed away from his desk and then said, get away from me. So we have to be very careful about when we're trying to control or contain a situation, that we don't make it worse and escalate it by trying to make close contact with the student, because sometimes that's not the best practice. I think someone just put something in the chat.
It was a Spanish translation of the.
Oh, okay. All right. So then who else should be involved in this?
Should be involved in what, Kim? Conversation?
In the conversation, because the principal has pulled the teacher in now, and he wants to talk, or she wants to talk about suspension, right? So should there be anyone else involved?
Case
manager, right on, yes, and possibly support services, right? Maybe the school psychologist, social worker, or school counselor, they might know the student really well, know of these actions, and so they can actually talk about it a little bit more in supporting the teacher. Okay, what do you think this should be, an in-school or out-of-school suspension, or maybe neither? What do you think? Neither. Can you tell me why? If you don't want to tell me why, can you tell me some other alternatives?
Seems related to the disability.
Very good. So what are some other ideas that we can have rather than in school or out of school?
How about just counseling?
And that's where that other piece, number 2, where it says who else should be involved. That might be enough, because honestly, the child did not intend harm. So the shouting and, pushing away from his desk certainly is not suspendable. Now, you may say that because he made contact with the teacher, that was suspendable. I'm sorry, what was that?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. So if you have another alternative instead of the suspension and addressing those particular issues, and also actually going back to that whole thing about the Latin root for teaching and learning, and reinforcing, you know, what our routines are and also what our expectations are, that is a really good learning place for that child. And so sort of like isolating him by putting him in ISS or OSS is not always the best solution to resolving the issue, but we want him to learn from his mistake, and this is the best route I think we can go. Now, I do know that some folks have had disagreements because of the fact that it was the kid did make contact with a teacher. So they would actually, I have had leaders say that they would actually still do an in-school suspension with services and counseling for the child while they're in school suspension. But this is certainly not a out-of-school suspension. That's just so you know.
So Kim, it's 1:31.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh my
So
goodness.
Jovi, if you could launch the poll, that would be helpful. But I don't know if you have a chance to open up for the floor for questions in the meantime.
Yeah, I would love to. Anyone have any questions about that
Or about anything?
or anything? This is a quiet bunch today.
I think it's the long weekend.
Oh, that's okay. That could be it. Well, listen, if you don't have any questions, thank you for joining us today. Do really appreciate it. But if you really want to have more conversations with me about this, you know, feel free to contact me at the State Department. I can actually put my email in the chat. And if you have any other questions regarding this, I do appreciate your time. And again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to give me a call.
So I also
Or
want to
email
let
me.
folks know we're going to post this on our CPAC YouTube channel. So if you want to refer back to it, because it's very dense and there's a lot of great information, we're going to have the presentations there, and everyone is open. We're open to sending PowerPoints to anyone who would like to see that. So feel free to ask or reach out to Kim or to CPAC. Our number's in the chat as well, but it will be available on YouTube for you to view or to share with your staff.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Those who are still on,
Great.
finish the poll, please. We only have
Oh, sorry.
8:24.
Please fill out the poll. It's very helpful to the federal government. That tells us if the information we shared is useful or not.
We got 9.